You know, I played you in the picture, and you are you, and I am me, and since you are you, and I was you.
Tied up with strings, these are a few of my favorite things.
At 89 years old, Julie Andrews remains one of the most recognizable and beloved performers in the history of film. For generations, she has been remembered as the flying nanny with the umbrella, the singing governess on an Austrian mountainside, the voice that could fill a concert hall without a microphone. But behind that graceful, composed image was a childhood defined by hardship, a career built on relentless work, and a personal life marked by both deep love and real heartbreak. In her memoirs, Andrews has opened up about parts of her story that many fans never knew, and looking at her full journey, from a 9-year-old performer standing on a beer crate to reach a microphone, to an 89-year-old icon still shaping how the world remembers her, is to understand just how much lies beneath the poised surface the public came to know. This is her story, in her own words where possible and in full. Julie Andrews was born Julia Elizabeth Wells on October 1st, 1935, in Walton-on-Thames, a town in Surrey, England. Her parents, Barbara and Edward Wells, were both teachers, and by any ordinary measure, her early life should have looked unremarkable. It didn't stay that way for long. Her mother, Barbara, left her father for a Canadian tenor named Ted Andrews, and Julie eventually took his surname, even though, as she would only learn years later, he was not her biological father. What Ted Andrews did give her, alongside her mother, was a doorway into performance. Julie's singing voice was extraordinary even as a small child, a rare 4-octave range that set her apart from almost anyone else on a stage. Her mother and stepfather noticed quickly, and by the time Julie was 9 years old, she was already performing alongside them in music halls and vaudeville acts across England. Because she was so small, she had to stand on an overturned beer crate just to reach the microphone. It's a detail that sounds almost charming in isolation, a tiny girl on a wooden crate, singing her heart out. But the reality behind it was far less whimsical. Julie wasn't performing as a hobby or a novelty act. She was, in a very real sense, becoming the breadwinner for her family before she was even a teenager. Her home life, meanwhile, was unstable. Both Ted Andrews and her mother struggled with alcohol, and Ted's drinking in particular created an atmosphere of fear in the household. Andrews has written candidly in her memoir about one of the most painful truths of her childhood, that Ted, when drunk, attempted on more than one occasion to come into her bedroom inappropriately. She responded the only way a child in that position could. She put a lock on her own bedroom door. It's a devastating detail precisely because of how ordinary the rest of her childhood is often assumed to have been. The image most people carry of Julie Andrews is one of effortless, wholesome grace. The truth is that grace was hard-won, forged by a girl who had to protect herself, support her family financially, and grow up long before she was ready to. By her early teens, Andrews' earnings from performing were substantial enough that she was able to help buy a house for her family, an extraordinary achievement for someone still years away from adulthood. But that success came at a cost. There was little time left over for a conventional education, for friendships, or for the ordinary freedoms of childhood. Her job, in effect, was to keep her family financially afloat, and she did it without complaint, carrying a kind of quiet responsibility that would come to define much of her early life. At 15, another difficult truth surfaced. Andrews learned that Ted Andrews was not her biological father at all. Her real father, she discovered, was a family friend her mother had been involved with during the war. It was one more piece of emotional upheaval layered onto an already complicated childhood. And yet, through all of it, Julie kept working, kept performing, and kept moving forward. Despite, or perhaps because of, the responsibilities placed on her so young, Andrews' talent could not be contained. At just 12 years old, she performed in front of the royal family at the Royal Command Performance. By 13, she'd made her West End debut in Starlight Roof. Her career accelerated through the early 1950s, and in 1954, she crossed the Atlantic to star on Broadway in The Boyfriend. Her true breakthrough came in 1956, when she originated the role of Eliza Doolittle in the Broadway production of My Fair Lady. It made her a star on both sides of the Atlantic almost overnight. When the film adaptation of My Fair Lady was cast a few years later, the studio controversially gave the role to Audrey Hepburn instead, a decision many at the time felt overlooked Andrews' clear ownership of the part. But where one door closed, another opened in a way few could predict it. Walt Disney had seen Andrews on stage and believed she was exactly right for a very different role, the title character in Mary Poppins. The film, released in 1964, became a sensation, and it marked Andrews' very first screen role. The following year, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress with Performance, an almost unheard-of achievement for a film debut. Just 1 year later, in 1965, she starred as Maria in The Sound of Music, playing a spirited young woman who becomes governess to 7 children in Austria on the eve of World War II. Between these two films, Andrews became not just a star, but a global symbol of warmth, decency, and grace. That image, however, came with a cost of its own. Andrews found herself typecast almost immediately, beloved for characters who were sweet, proper, and cheerful, and increasingly boxed by that perception. Over the following decades, she would spend considerable energy trying to prove there was more to her than the wholesome image audiences had fallen in love with. Her career continued through film, television, and stage work into the 1980s and 1990s. But in 1997, she faced a professional crisis that would change the course of her life. She underwent surgery to remove non-cancerous nodules from her vocal cords, a procedure that, tragically, damaged her singing voice permanently. For a woman who had built her entire life and identity around that voice since childhood, the loss was devastating. She later filed a lawsuit against the surgeons involved, which was eventually settled. Rather than retreat from performing altogether, Andrews found new creative outlets, most notably lending her voice to animated films in the 2000s. Audiences around the world came to know her as Queen Lillian in the Shrek franchise, introducing her warmth to an entirely new generation who had never seen her sing on screen at all. Andrews' personal life was every bit as layered as her professional one. In 1959, she married Tony Walton, a set and costume designer she had known since they were both quite young. The two shared a genuine creative partnership. Tony worked on many of her early stage productions and later helped design the costumes for Mary Poppins itself. In 1962, the couple welcomed a daughter, Emma Walton. But the demands of Andrews' rapidly growing film career, combined with the pressures on Tony's own work, gradually pulled the marriage apart, and the couple divorced in 1967. They remained on good terms afterward and continued to co-parent Emma together. Not long after her divorce, Andrews met the film director and screenwriter Blake Edwards, the creative force behind hits like Breakfast at Tiffany's and the Pink Panther series. Their first encounter was almost accidental. By Andrews' own account, the two happened to be pulling into the driveway of the same therapist's office at the same time. It wasn't a romantic meeting by any conventional measure, but something between them clicked, and after several years of dating, they married in 1969. Their marriage would go on to last more than 4 decades, and by all accounts, it was the most significant relationship of Andrews' life, though far from an easy one. Blake Edwards directed several of her films, including S.O.B. and Victor/Victoria, and the two often worked side by side. But Edwards also struggled with serious, chronic health problems throughout their marriage: gallbladder issues, back pain, recurring infections, and bouts of infectious mononucleosis. He also dealt with depression and significant mood swings. Andrews has spoken candidly in interviews about how demanding this period of caretaking was, describing the emotional toll of supporting a partner through repeated medical and psychological struggles. Together, the couple built a large blended family. Andrews brought her daughter Emma. Edwards brought 2 children from a previous marriage, Jennifer and Jeffrey. In the early 1970s, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the couple expanded their family further by adopting 2 Vietnamese girls, Amy and Joanna. It was a household built from very different pieces, held together by 2 strong, creative people who understood each other's worlds in a way few others could. As the years passed, Edwards' health continued to decline. Andrews remained by his side throughout, and in 2010, he died of complications from pneumonia. Andrews has said in interviews that his death left her feeling profoundly lost, that the bond between them had been so deep and constant that his absence was something she felt every single day afterward. It was, by her own account, one of the most significant and formative losses of her life. Of all the roles Julie Andrews has played, none is more closely tied to her public image than Mary Poppins, the impossibly composed endlessly capable nanny who seemed to embody old-fashioned propriety itself. But according to Andrews' own memoir, Homework, there was always more going on beneath that character's tidy exterior than most audiences realized. While being fitted for her Mary Poppins costume, Andrews' then husband Tony Walton, who was also the film's costume designer, made an observation that stuck with her. He suggested that Mary Poppins might secretly take a quiet pleasure in being just a little bit wicked, a little bit naughty, beneath her buttoned-up exterior. It wasn't just a passing thought. Walton built the idea directly into the costume itself. While the coats Mary wore appeared prim and sensible on the outside, their linings were bright coral and primrose, and her petticoats were unexpectedly colorful and playful, small details most audiences would never notice, but ones that hinted at a hidden layer of mischief underneath the character's strict exterior. Andrews found the idea fitting, and it clearly resonated with how she thought about her own public image as well. On screen, she had become the picture of moral rectitude, kind, proper, endlessly composed. Off-screen, by her own admission, she had a cheekier streak than her characters ever let on. She wasn't rebellious in any dramatic sense, but she never fully fit the saintly image Hollywood had built around her, and in interviews over the years, she has embraced that gap between the character and the woman playing her with humor rather than discomfort. That willingness to poke fun at her own wholesome reputation showed up in other, less scripted moments during filming as well. During one flying stunt on wires for Mary Poppins, something went wrong with the rigging, and Andrews came crashing to ground instead of landing smoothly. Caught off guard and in pain, she let out a string of curse words on the spot, with producer Walt Disney standing nearby. Andrews later remarked that she was fairly certain it was language Uncle Walt, as many on set affectionately called him, had never heard directed at him before. It wasn't an isolated incident, either. Karen Trice, the child actress who played Jane Banks, later recalled being stunned one day to see Andrews, still fully dressed in her tidy Mary Poppins costume, hat and gloves included, smoking a cigarette and swearing at the crew between takes. For an 8-year-old working alongside someone she saw as the embodiment of perfect manners, it was a genuinely startling sight. By the time Andrews filmed the Americanization of Emily in 1964, she had already become one of the most famous faces in the world thanks to Mary Poppins. But that film hadn't asked much of her romantically on screen. Emily was different. A wartime romantic drama set in London during World War II, considerably more adult in tone than anything she'd done before. In it, she played an English war widow who falls for a charming American officer, played by James Garner, and the script called for her to perform her very first on-screen love scene. Andrews was 28 at the time, and despite years of stage experience, she had almost no experience with intimate scenes on film or, by her own account, much romantic experience in her personal life to draw from either. In her memoir and in interviews, she has described feeling genuinely out of her depth, uncertain of what was even expected of her in a scripted romantic moment. She later told ABC News that she had no real idea what she was supposed to do with something as simple as an on-screen kiss. What made the experience bearable, she has said, was James Garner himself. She described him as an easygoing professional and reassuring scene partner, someone whose calm presence helped settle her nerves rather than heighten them. Garner never rushed her or made her feel pressured, and that support allowed her to get through a moment that felt entirely foreign to her. The emotional weight of the scene surprised her more than she expected. After filming Wrapped, she stood up to walk away and found her legs literally gave out beneath her. It wasn't fear or embarrassment, she later explained, but the sheer emotional intensity of stepping into completely unfamiliar territory that had physically overwhelmed her. If audiences remember one image above all others from Andrews' career, it's likely the opening shot of The Sound of Music, Maria twirling joyfully in a wide alpine meadow as the camera sweeps in from above, mountains rising behind her. On screen, it looks effortless and serene. Behind the scenes, according to Andrews' own account, it was nothing short of a nightmare to film. The shot required a helicopter-mounted camera, a genuinely novel and difficult technique for the era. The helicopter had to fly low over the meadow to capture the sweeping angle the director wanted. But every time it got close enough for a usable shot, the powerful downwash from its blades knocked Andrews flat onto her back. She would get up, brush the mud and grass off her costume, walk back to her mark, and try again only for the same thing to happen. It took 9 full takes to finally get the shot, all performed in the damp, chilly conditions of the Austrian mountains rather than a controlled studio environment. By the end of the day, Andrews has said she was simply exhausted and sore, thinking of nothing but getting back to a hot bath at the hotel. That wasn't the only mishap during production. The studio wanted Andrews' hair lightened for the role, and the first attempt at dyeing her naturally brown hair went badly wrong, turning it a startling shade of orange. The solution was to cut it short and dye it blonde instead, and the resulting look became such an iconic part of Maria's character that few would guess it was born out of styling accident rather than a deliberate creative choice. By the early 1980s, Andrews has spent nearly 2 decades as a symbol of wholesome, family-friendly entertainment. After years of being offered variations on the same kind of role, she made a deliberate choice to do something different. In 1981, she starred in S.O.B., a dark satirical comedy directed by her husband Blake Edwards that skewered the pressures of fame and the entertainment industry's obsession with sex appeal. In the film, Andrews played a squeaky clean actress, not unlike her own public persona, who was convinced by her director husband to take part in a much racier remake of a failing film. In one scene, Andrews appeared topless on screen for the first time in her career. The reaction was immediate and intense. Longtime fans who had grown up watching her as a magical nanny or a singing governess were caught off guard, and public opinion split sharply between those who admired her willingness to take a creative risk and those who felt it undercut the image they associated with her. Andrews, for her part, was clear-eyed about what she was doing. In interviews at the time, she described the choice as a deliberate step toward reclaiming creative control over her own career, rather than remaining permanently confined to the limited kinds of roles she'd been offered for years. Edwards, who directed the film, understood exactly the effect it would have and worked closely with her to handle the material thoughtfully. Despite the controversy it generated, the film marked an important turning point, reminding audiences that Andrews was a far more versatile performer than her earlier career had allowed her to show. Andrews has said that it was through her long relationship with Blake Edwards that she came to understand love in its fullest, most complicated form. When they met in the late 1960s, she was still recovering from the end of her first marriage, and Edwards, witty, charming, but undeniably complex,